Ethan Carter ran through the dense alien jungle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart pounded as branches and thick vines whipped against his skin, leaving stinging cuts. The only sound louder than his racing pulse was the mechanical growls echoing behind him. He had been running for hours, but his pursuers never tired. Unlike him, they were designed for the hunt. He pressed himself against a massive tree, gripping his side where a deep gash bulged through his torn uniform. His ship had crashed hours ago, shot down by an unknown enemy. He had survived the impact, barely, only to realize that the planet was not deserted. Something had been watching him from the moment he stumbled from the wreckage. Red eyes glowed in the darkness. The hunters were close. Ethan reached for his combat knife, his only weapon left, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. These creatures were larger than him, faster, and cloaked in advanced armor. He had seen what they did to another survivor. The screams had lasted for minutes before silence swallowed them. A branch snapped behind him. Ethan spun around, ready to fight, but before he could strike, a massive shadow moved through the trees. The hunters stiffened, their heads snapping toward the figure that had just arrived. A low, rumbling growl filled the air, but it wasn't coming from them. It came from her. The figure stepped forward, and the moonlight revealed a tall, armored woman with deep violet skin and glowing golden eyes. Her body was encased in sleek, black battle armor, and in her hand, she held a long spear crackling with blue energy. Her presence made the hunters hesitate. Then she struck. She moved like lightning, her spear slicing through the nearest hunter's throat before it could react. Another leaped at her, but she ducked under its claws and drove her weapon into its chest. It let out a strangled cry before collapsing at her feet. The remaining hunters hesitated, then turned and vanished into the trees. They knew they were outmatched. Ethan stood frozen, watching in disbelief. The woman turned to face him, tilting her head as if studying him. He took a step back, gripping his knife, but before he could react, she was in front of him. "You belong to me now, human," she said. Before he could resist, she snapped a metallic collar around his neck. It locked in place with a soft click, and suddenly, Ethan felt a sharp jolt run through his body. His muscles locked, his vision blurred, and he collapsed to his knees. He gritted his teeth, fighting against the paralysis. "Do you what the hell?" She crouched in front of him, her golden eyes watching him with something between amusement and curiosity. "I have never seen one of your kind up close. You are interesting." Ethan tried to move, but the collar sent another pulse of energy through him. His body refused to obey. His breathing was heavy as he glared up at her. "I'm not your pet." The woman smirked. "We shall see." She grabbed him by the front of his torn uniform and lifted him as if he weighed nothing. His vision swam as she slung him over her shoulder and carried him through the jungle like he was nothing more than a captured animal. Ethan clenched his jaw, swallowing the anger burning inside him. He wasn't a slave. He wasn't property. He didn't know who this woman was, but he would find a way to escape. As she carried him toward the towering silhouette of an alien fortress in the distance, one thought burned in his mind. He would not stay in this cage for long. Ethan's head throbbed as he woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. His body ached, his limbs stiff from whatever had been injected into him. The cold metal collar around his neck sent a dull hum through his skin, a constant reminder that he was no longer free. He forced his eyes open and immediately realized he was no longer in the jungle. The room around him was vast, lined with towering stone pillars and glowing blue symbols etched into the walls. The air smelled of burning incense, mixed with something metallic and sharp. He was lying on a raised platform, surrounded by tall, alien figures watching him like he was some strange new creature they had never seen before. They whispered among themselves, some laughing, others shaking their heads. Ethan pushed himself up, muscles protesting at the effort. His eyes locked onto the one figure who wasn't amused. The same violet-skinned warrior woman who had captured him stood at the far end of the chamber, arms crossed, golden eyes watching him with quiet intensity. "You wake," she said, her voice steady, emotionless. Ethan gritted his teeth, testing his strength. The moment he moved too quickly, the collar pulsed with a sharp shock, making his muscles tighten painfully. He let out a breath, realizing it wasn't just for show. She had complete control over him. "Take this off," he growled. She tilted her head slightly, as if amused by his demand. "No." He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "What do you want from me?" One of the other aliens, a tall male with deep crimson markings across his face, stepped forward and said something in their language. The warrior woman replied, and whatever she said made the others chuckle darkly. Ethan didn't like that. Then she turned to him. "They are curious. No human has ever stood before as Irelian warlord before. They wish to see if you are truly as weak as they believe." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "I'm not weak." She smiled at that, a slow, knowing smirk. "Then prove it." Before he could react, two massive doors at the end of the chamber slid open, and a deafening roar filled the air. Ethan turned his head just in time to see a hulking creature being led inside. It was twice his size, its thick reptilian skin covered in jagged scars. Its yellow eyes locked onto him, and he knew instantly that whatever this thing was, it had killed before. Ethan's stomach twisted as he realized what was happening. This wasn't a test. This was a game, a spectacle. The warrior woman stepped down from her platform and approached him. "Fight," she commanded. Ethan looked at her, then at the beast that was now unchained and advancing toward him, claws clicking against the stone floor. His heart pounded. He had no weapons, no armor. He was half-starved, still weak from the crash. He was going to die. The creature lunged. Ethan barely rolled out of the way, the force of its attack sending shockwaves through the ground. He scrambled to his feet just as it spun, its tail whipping toward him like a battering ram. He ducked, the air cutting past his head as it missed him by inches. The alien spectators cheered, shouting in excitement. Ethan knew he couldn't fight this thing head-on. He needed to be smarter, faster. He dodged again, but the beast was relentless, its powerful legs closing the distance in seconds. This time, it swiped at him with razor-sharp claws, tearing through the fabric of his uniform and slicing into his arm. He bit back a cry of pain, staggering back as blood dripped onto the floor. The warrior woman watched him closely. Ethan's mind raced. He had no weapons, but he had something better, his environment. He glanced at the walls, the stone pillars, the flickering energy torches lining the chamber. He didn't need strength to win. He needed leverage. The beast charged again, and this time, Ethan ran toward it. The moment before impact, he dropped to the ground and slid beneath its massive legs. He grabbed one of the torches as he passed, the energy crackling against his fingers. The crowd gasped as he spun and drove the torch directly into the creature's side. A howl of pain echoed through the chamber as the beast stumbled, its thick hide burning where the torch had made contact. Ethan didn't stop. He leaped onto the creature's back, wrapping his arm around its thick neck. With every ounce of strength, he twisted, forcing its head down, guiding its momentum straight into one of the massive stone pillars. The impact was brutal. The beast let out one last cry before collapsing, its body going limp beneath him. Silence filled the chamber. Ethan rolled off the creature, panting, his body aching from exhaustion. He pushed himself up, turning to face the warrior woman. The collar hummed against his skin, but she didn't activate it. She simply stared at him, golden eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. She stood in front of him, looking down at the battered human who had just defied every expectation. "You are not weak," she admitted. Ethan wiped the blood from his brow, his jaw tight. "I told you." The other Xyrilian warriors murmured among themselves, no longer laughing. The way they looked at him had changed. He wasn't just an amusement anymore. The warrior woman smirked. Perhaps you are more than just a pet after all. Ethan sat in the dimly lit chamber, his back against the cold stone wall, his body still aching from the brutal fight. The alien warriors had left hours ago, but the memory of their laughter and murmurs still echoed in his mind. He wasn't just some weak, helpless creature to them anymore. He had proven himself, but he wasn't interested in impressing them. He needed to get out of here. The collar around his neck was still there, a constant reminder that he wasn't free. He had tested it earlier, touching it carefully, but every time he even thought about trying to pry it off, it sent a sharp jolt through his body, strong enough to make his muscles seize. He needed another way. The door to his chamber slid open with a soft hiss. He tensed, preparing for another test or maybe even another fight. But instead, it was her, the warrior woman. She stepped inside, her golden eyes locking onto him as she crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps. She carried a tray of food, strange-looking meat and fruits that he didn't recognize. She placed it in front of him and stood back, watching. Ethan stared at the food. He was starving, but he knew better than to trust it right away. He looked up at her, poisoned. She smirked. If I wanted you dead, you would be dead. He didn't argue. His stomach growled, and after a brief hesitation, he picked up a piece of the meat and bit into it. It was tough but edible, slightly salty with an unfamiliar aftertaste. He chewed slowly, watching her as she studied him like he was some rare animal she had discovered. You fight well, she said finally. Better than expected. Ethan swallowed the food and wiped his mouth. You don't sound too happy about that. She tilted her head slightly, considering his words. It is interesting. He leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. So what now? Am I still just a pet to you? Her expression didn't change. Perhaps not. That wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was better than nothing. She took a step closer. You want to leave. He met her gaze, refusing to look away. Obviously. She didn't react right away, just watched him with that unreadable expression. Then, to his surprise, she crouched down so they were at eye level. You would not survive out there alone. He scoffed. I survived the crash. I survived your little arena game. And I'm still here, aren't I? Her golden eyes studied him carefully. You are stubborn. I call it determination. She exhaled through her nose, something close to amusement flickering in her eyes. You are not ready to escape. Ethan's jaw tightened. Watch me. She didn't move, but the collar suddenly pulsed. A sharp jolt ran through his body, making his muscles tense against his will. He clenched his teeth, refusing to let out a sound, but his vision blurred for a moment from the pain. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. She leaned in slightly, her voice calm but firm. This collar binds you to me. Even if you found a way to escape, it would bring you back. Ethan's breathing was heavy as he glared at her. So what? You're just going to keep me locked up forever? She studied him for a long moment before she finally spoke. No. That answer caught him off guard. He wasn't expecting her to admit that. She stood up, looking down at him. You are human. Your kind is unpredictable, dangerous. I have been given orders to break you, to make you obedient. Ethan clenched his fists, anger bubbling inside him. And if I refuse? For the first time, her expression softened, just slightly. Then you will suffer. He narrowed his eyes. And if I obey? She tilted her head. Then you may survive. That wasn't much of an offer, but Ethan wasn't stupid. He needed to play this carefully. If he was going to escape, he had to be patient. He needed information, and the best way to get that was to make her believe he was starting to cooperate. He exhaled slowly, loosening his fists. Fine. What do you want from me? She watched him for a moment, as if deciding whether to believe him. Then she smirked. I want to see what you are truly capable of. Ethan didn't like the sound of that, but he forced himself to nod. All right. But first, he gestured to the food. At least let me finish eating. She chuckled softly, turning to leave. Eat, human. You will need your strength. As the door closed behind her, Ethan took another bite of the food, his mind already working through a plan. He wasn't broken. He wasn't giving up. She thought she was in control, but she had no idea what a desperate human was capable of. Ethan stood at the edge of the training ground, his muscles aching from endless drills and sparring matches. The alien warriors surrounding him moved with lethal precision, their bodies built for combat, their strikes fast and unforgiving. He had trained for weeks under their watchful eyes, forced to fight, forced to prove himself. But he wasn't just learning to survive. He was gathering information. Every movement, every command, every security weakness. He wasn't their pet. He wasn't their warrior. He was a man preparing for war. The alien woman, Sci-Fi, watched him from a distance, her golden eyes sharp as she observed his stance. She had been his trainer, his captor, and now, unknowingly, the one giving him the knowledge he needed to fight back. She stepped forward, her heavy boots crunching against the dry earth. You are improving, human, but you still hesitate. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow. I'm just pacing myself. Wouldn't want to break all your warriors in one day. A flicker of amusement passed across her face. Confidence is dangerous without discipline. And control without challenge leads to weakness, he shot back. She studied him for a moment before nodding. You learn quickly. Ethan wasn't here to impress her. He was here to find a way out. He had been watching the guards, memorizing the patrol routes, the way the security drones hovered around the base, the frequency of the power surges that sometimes made the energy barriers flicker. The alien empire thought their technology made them invincible, but Ethan had already spotted cracks in their armor. That night, as the twin moons hung low in the sky, Ethan moved through the dim corridors of the outpost, careful not to draw attention. He had started to notice something, whispers between the lower-ranked aliens, murmurs of discontent. Not everyone in the Empire was happy with their rule. Some warriors were questioning their orders, and Ethan planned to use that. He reached a storage bay, its door left partially open. Inside, two alien soldiers stood arguing in hushed voices. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. This war is pointless, one of them growled. We were meant to conquer, not turn planets into graves. The Council doesn't care, the other muttered. They see everything as numbers. They don't fight these battles. We do. Ethan's pulse quickened. These weren't just grumblings. This was the beginning of something bigger. A rebellion. He stepped into the doorway, making his presence known. The two aliens tensed, their hands moving to their weapons. You want to stop this war, Ethan said, keeping his voice low but firm. Then you're going to need a plan, and you're going to need me. The first alien narrowed his eyes. A human thinks he can help us. Ethan took a step closer. I don't just think it. I know it. Your leaders see you as disposable. You said it yourself. But if you really want to fight back, you need someone who doesn't think like them. Someone unpredictable. The second alien hesitated. Why would you help us? Ethan's jaw tightened. Because I refuse to be a slave. And because your people took everything from me. You want to fight? Then let's fight. There was a long silence. Then the first alien exhaled sharply. Meet us tomorrow at the lower barracks. If you're serious, we'll see what you can do. Ethan nodded once and slipped away before they could change their minds. The next day, Sci-Fi called him for another training session, but Ethan could see it in her eyes. She knew something was changing. You have been restless, she said as they circled each other in the training pit. Why? Ethan smirked. Maybe I'm just getting tired of being on a leash. Sci-Fi lunged, her movements fast as she aimed a strike at his ribs. He dodged, countering with a quick jab that she barely deflected. You think you can challenge me? She asked, her tone unreadable. Ethan stepped back, breathing heavily. I think you're starting to wonder if you can control me. Sci-Fi didn't reply, but he saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She knew he was changing. She just didn't know how much. That night, Ethan met with the rebels. They showed him the stockpile of weapons they had been gathering: plasma rifles, energy grenades, stolen combat gear. They had numbers, but no leader, no strategy. That was where he came in. Over the next few days, Ethan worked with them in secret. He helped them map out the outpost's weak points, identify which guards could be swayed and which would fight to the end. Every night, he trained harder, pushing himself beyond exhaustion, preparing for what was coming. Then, the moment arrived. An explosion ripped through the eastern barracks, setting off alarms across the base. Ethan moved through the chaos, his stolen weapon in hand, leading a group of rebels as they took down the guards one by one. The Empire had underestimated them. They had underestimated him. Sci-Fi found him in the middle of the battle. She stood across the courtyard, her expression unreadable as she watched him fight. "This is what you wanted," she said, her voice carrying over the gunfire. "War." Ethan tightened his grip on his weapon. "No, this is what you forced me to become." For the first time, she hesitated. Then, with a sharp breath, she threw down her weapon. "You want to fight for freedom," she said. "Then fight." Ethan didn't know if she was testing him or surrendering, but there was no time to question it. The battle was raging, and he had a war to win. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking, as explosions echoed through the outpost. Ethan sprinted across the battlefield, plasma rifle in hand, his heart pounding with adrenaline. The rebellion had begun, but the war was far from over. The Empire's forces were regrouping, and the true battle was about to begin. Behind him, the rebels moved fast, securing key positions and taking down any loyalist soldiers who stood in their way. The night sky burned with the glow of fire and energy blasts, casting eerie shadows over the war-torn landscape. Ethan knew they had come too far to turn back now. This was it, their last stand. Sci-Fi stood at the edge of the command tower, watching the chaos unfold. For the first time in her life, she hesitated. She had been raised to believe in the Empire's strength, its control over weaker species, but now she was witnessing something she had never expected: a human leading an army, defying the very laws of the galaxy. And despite everything, she couldn't look away. Ethan caught sight of her through the smoke, their eyes locking for a brief moment. There was no hatred in his gaze, only determination. She wasn't his enemy anymore. Not truly. The Empire was. A sudden explosion shook the ground, knocking Ethan off his feet. He barely had time to roll before a soldier lunged at him, blade flashing. Ethan reacted on instinct, dodging the strike and slamming the butt of his rifle into the soldier's head. The alien staggered but didn't fall. The two clashed in the middle of the battlefield, energy bolts flying past them. Ethan ducked under another swing, then grabbed the soldier's arm and twisted, forcing him to the ground. Before the alien could recover, Ethan drove his fist into his jaw, knocking him unconscious. There was no time to rest. He turned to see another wave of enemies advancing toward the rebels, their heavy armor gleaming under the firelight. They had called reinforcements. If the rebels didn't act fast, they would be overwhelmed. Ethan rushed to the barricade where his allies were taking cover. "We have to take out that command center," he shouted, pointing to the heavily guarded building at the heart of the outpost. "If we can cut their communications, they won't be able to call for more troops." One of the rebel leaders, a towering alien with battle scars, nodded. "Then let's move before it's too late." The team pushed forward, dodging enemy fire as they made their way toward the command center. Ethan led the charge, his mind focused on one goal: taking down the Empire's control. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every enslaved soldier, for every life crushed under the Empire's rule. Blaster fire erupted from the rooftops as enemy snipers took aim. One of the rebels fell beside Ethan, his body lifeless before it even hit the ground. The sight fueled Ethan's rage, but he forced himself to stay focused. They had to keep moving. They reached the outer doors of the command center, but it was heavily fortified. The entrance was sealed, protected by an energy shield too strong to breach with simple weapons. Ethan turned to Sci-Fi, who had followed them despite the battle raging around them. "Can you shut it down?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I can override the security, but it'll take time." "We don't have time," Ethan shot back. Sci-Fi took a deep breath and pressed her palm against the control panel, her fingers moving quickly over the holographic interface. The shield flickered, then shut down with a surge of sparks. "Go," she yelled. Ethan and the rebels stormed inside, taking down the guards in their path. The command center was a maze of corridors, but Ethan had memorized the layout. He led them straight to the control room, where a group of high-ranking officers stood in shock at the sight of their fortress being breached. One of the officers reached for a weapon, but Ethan fired first, taking him down before he could react. The rest of the officers scrambled, trying to send out distress signals, but the rebels moved fast, cutting off all communications. Ethan stepped forward, his rifle trained on the last officer standing. "It's over." The officer sneered. "You think this rebellion will change anything? The Empire will never fall." Ethan's jaw clenched. Maybe not today. But this is just the beginning. He pulled the trigger, the officer collapsed, and with that, the Empire's control over the outpost was shattered. Outside, the remaining Loyalist forces realized they had lost. Some fought to the last breath, but others surrendered, dropping their weapons in defeat. The rebellion had won the battle, but Ethan knew the war was far from over. As the fires burned around them, he turned to Sci-Fi. "You had the chance to stop me. Why didn't you?" She stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Because I finally understand why you fight." Ethan exhaled, his body aching from the battle. "Then fight with us." Sci-Fi glanced at the battlefield, at the soldiers who had once been her allies now lying in defeat. Then she met Ethan's gaze and nodded. The Empire wouldn't stop hunting them. But tonight, they had won. And tomorrow, they would fight again. The battlefield was quiet now. Smoke still lingered in the air, and the distant glow of fires painted the horizon in shades of red and orange. Bodies of fallen warriors, both human and alien, lay scattered across the ruined outpost. The war had not ended, but this battle was over. The rebellion had won, at least for now. Ethan stood at the edge of the wreckage, gripping his rifle loosely. His body ached from wounds he hadn't even noticed in the heat of the fight. Blood, some of it his, some of it not, streaked his armor. He was exhausted, but his mind was still racing. The Empire would come back stronger. They would retaliate. There was no time to celebrate. Footsteps approached behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Sci-Fi. He could recognize her presence anywhere now. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, no longer as a commander of the Empire, but as someone who had chosen a different path. She stopped beside him, silent for a moment as she took in the aftermath of the battle. Her golden eyes, once filled with certainty and pride, now held something else. Doubt, sorrow, something she didn't want to name. "You did it," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. "You led them to victory." Ethan let out a breath. "For now." He glanced at her. "You had the chance to stop me. You didn't." She hesitated before answering. "Because I didn't want to." Ethan studied her face. This was the same warrior who had once looked at him as nothing more than a captive, a pawn in the Empire's endless war. Now she looked at him as something else, something she was still trying to understand. "I made a choice," she continued, "not just to let you go, but to stand against everything I once believed in." Ethan nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. He had hated her in the beginning, resented her for what she represented. But now, he didn't know what he felt anymore. Sci-Fi exhaled slowly and turned to face him fully. "You are free now, Evan. You no longer belong to me." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He had never belonged to her. Not really. He had fought for his freedom, had taken it with his own hands. And yet, the way she said it, it felt different. He looked at her, his voice quieter now. "No, I don't belong to you." He took a step closer. "But I think I belong with you." Sci-Fi stiffened slightly, as if she hadn't expected those words. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the distant echoes of survivors tending to the wounded, rebuilding what was left. But here, in this moment, it was just them. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. Ethan smirked, exhaustion and something else making his expression softer. "Welcome to being human. We don't either." A flicker of amusement passed over her face, but it didn't last. She reached out, hesitating for just a second before placing a hand against his chest, where his heartbeat was steady and strong. He didn't pull away. "I was your captor," she murmured. "I was your enemy." Ethan shook his head. "Not anymore." Something changed in her eyes then, something deep and unspoken. The war wasn't over. The Empire wouldn't stop hunting them. There were battles yet to be fought, sacrifices yet to be made. But right now, in the silence after the storm, all that mattered was this. She didn't own him. He wasn't hers. But in a way neither of them could fully understand yet. They belonged to each other.